Coming up, we kick off August by pushing a pause on all the speculation around Kevin Durant. How so? Giving you our final takes on how we think the Brooklyn Nets saga ends and whether or not we should be optimistic. All coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, yes. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner, operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, we kick this one off, like we said at the top. There's going to be a lot of things to break down as we get into August, as we move towards September. What is this team going to do going forward? Expectations for a lot of the players like TJ Warren, like Royce O'Neal, like Cam Thomas and Day'Ron Sharpe and Kessler Edwards. Patty Mills coming back, right? There's so many facets that we're going to dive into here. And I think for our sake and for the sake of the fan base, we wanted to push a pause on all this Kevin Durant talk, but let's make it one last time. One last case. For right now, what do we think?
Let's put a pin in it. Yeah, try to put a pin in it. And for some of this is for sanity's sake. Some of this is because there is other things to talk about in Nets world, and we sometimes can feel like this is all encompassing. In a lot of ways, it is. Like there's a reason why we have to talk about this a lot. When a player like Kevin Durant gets possibly traded, that is a national, NBA storyline for a long time. That's just the way it is. At the same time, we are in sort of a downtime in the NBA news cycle. So there's a feeling for us, at least, that, until there's more definitive news on this, we probably will have to spend, and we want to spend some other time on some of these other guys on the team, because there are definite players that are going to be back in the team. So I think today I know today that we'll make our predictions. I think, short of just some kind of bombshell news story, make our predictions now that we've seen how the landscape has unfolded, now that we see the teams that we think are interested, that the teams we think are not, the possible packages that are out there for Kevin Durant as it stands here on August 3rd. So, yeah, I think we'll make our predictions. Ours are different. We talked about them briefly. Yeah. We do have different predictions around this, so it'll be interesting to see how it lays out.
Yeah, just to be clear, if he does get traded, we'll come back. We'll talk about it. We're not going to put a moratorium on it fully throughout the rest of the offseason. We'll cover all the latest news. But if we can, we're going to give ourselves a little bit of a breather from it. Let's start with your version. As you said, organically, we came to different perspectives on what's going to happen. So where do you see things going? Trade, no trade, moving, staying, coming, going? I know that you have one very specific element that ties into this.
Yeah, so this is close for me, and at the beginning of all this, I still firmly am on. I've been calling it team run it back, and I've had some other people, quote me on that one in terms of Twitter. So maybe that one's catching on. Let's get that hashtag going, team run it back. But I've firmly in that camp.
Team run it back is like first round, like back first round playoff out. Is that the?
No, yeah, sorry, yeah, no, not that. Run up for just the actual guys. Yes. Okay, so. That's what I want to happen. This podcast is not about what we want to happen, is what we think will happen. I want to be very really clear about, there's a difference between our wants and the wills. And so there's, that's what it is. Before I get to what I think will happen, I will say the very close second for me in this one is that the Boston Celtics make a trade. If you had asked me this last Friday, I would have said it would have been like 60-40 Boston trades for him. And I am not on that percentage anymore, but I do think Boston has the most attractive package. Even though the news is a little old by NBA news cycle standards, they're one of the teams that we have had like a real player offered in a trade in Jaylen Brown. That has not been the case. We think from, I don't know who was offered from the Suns, if anybody. I don't know who was offered from the Raptors, if anybody. We do know that Jaylen Brown was offered to the Brooklyn Nets as part of a deal. If you had asked me last Friday, that would have been my thing. I think as we go into this now, I'm going to land on that he is back with the team. and that the Nets make every overture or case or whatever it is to say that this is in everyone's best interest to try to redo this thing, and then they work on selling him for the long haul. And say, hey, this is a blip and this is what it is. And I just still very much think that the Nets, if you really held them to the fire, if you really held their feet to the fire, I kind of think that they're hoping, short of being overwhelmed by a trade, that no offer comes. Like that no real offer comes. Because I actually think in my scenario now, that would actually make their life a lot easier. So that's kind of where I'm landing right now.
So then you think that, not you think, but I guess you do think, that this is, let's just get past the trade discussions. Let's get into the regular season. Let's start having Kevin Durant, who we've talked about, not a guy that we would think would sit out if trade hadn't materialized to this point. Let's get him on the court with Kyrie, with Ben Simmons, with TJ Warren, with Royce O'Neal, with all the young guys. Let's just start getting the sample size going. And at some point between now and, let's say, the trade deadline in February, Kevin Durant, it's just going to kind of go by the wayside. Hey, I'm under contract. We're winning games. It's good. We can be competitive. And that's the solve. The solve is just get him back on the court with this roster and remind him that you can compete and win here. It's just been a really rough few years.
Totally. And I think that actually and as I thought about this, I actually think things set up really well for that. Well, you got to put well in quotes here. It's nothing about this is set up well. As far, has set up okay for this scenario to play out. And a couple of reasons that I've landed on this one as mine. And I know yours is different, and we'll get to it, but the reasons are this. One is the team that he wanted to go to, Phoenix, does not have, in my mind, anywhere close to the assets to begin putting together a deal. And so that actually helps the Nets. Like, they just can't say it can't be Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson. You're Kevin Durant. You have 4 years. Like, it's just not even close. Sorry, that's not going to get it done. I think that helps the case for him coming back. I think that we haven't heard about this, that we don't know if Kevin Durant wants to go to Boston. Right? Like, there was nothing that came out that said, hey, that'd be a night that he was never on that list. Those were never on that list of teams. They just beat the Nets in the first round. Like, we've speculated why he might like it, but we've never heard that was not on one of the teams that he originally mentioned. So we've never heard that. That actually helps the case for him to come back too. There's an even better chance that he definitely wouldn't want to go to Toronto. And so we've never heard that either. So the team, and then we haven't mentioned the Pelicans, but that one, I don't think that materializes. So we've never heard anything but Phoenix. And for my scenario, that's good, because Phoenix, of those teams, has the worst to offer. Has nothing to, by comparison, nothing to offer for Kevin Durant. So I think when I look at it on all those ways, does that make sense? Because that was like my line of thinking. And then after that, it's like, hey, to get the training camp, you're not the kind of guy that's going to sit out. We know this about you. That's just not how you're built. That's not how you're wired. You're wired to win. And when you're on the team, let's get 10 games under our belt and see if you like the KD, Ben Simmons, Kyrie fit. We'll talk about Ben Simmons later too. But does that make sense? Can you sort of see that one? Like, have I laid out enough of sort of a bullet list of why I think this ends up becoming the most likely scenario?
Yeah, I think it's not unreasonable, right, to say, remember, on paper, as we always talk about, on paper, this is a team in the Brooklyn Nets with these players, with Kyrie, and now a healthy Ben Simmons. In other years, it was with James Harden, that they can be competitive and they can be competing for championships. So if that is the baseline, then yes, why wouldn't you feel like you can convince Kevin Durant to stay and be a part of it? I think the question becomes one, is there a fracture between the front office or ownership and Kevin Durant that is not bridgeable, right? That cannot be solved even by successful play. And then the other factor to me in your scenario would be, does Kevin Durant view the Brooklyn Nets with Kyrie, with Ben Simmons, as the most viable chance in the short and over the life cycle of his contract, best option for him to be able to win, right? I'm sure that he's doing the thought process of, what does the East look like? What does the West look like? And what do these potential teams that I could go to look like if I'm a part of it? And where would we be in that hierarchy? So I think that's the factor. If if Kevin Durant believes wherever I am is the best chance to win a championship, which would be very reasonable, then I think he goes down this road. So while I'm going to present my case and why I disagree, there's plenty of logic to what you're laying out here for Brooklyn and Kevin Durant to feel like, hey, let's just come back to the table and see how it goes.
And to be very clear, like, and I know some people have been accused of this. This is not copium, or this is me not just like trying to wish something to happen. I already know what I want to happen. It's actually not clouding my decision about this at all. Like, what I want to happen and what I believe will happen are really pretty separated at this point. And so I just want to be really clear about that, because it's like, oh, I've heard this I got a million times. Oh, Doug, you're just talking yourself into it. You just want it to be happen. No, it's just, that's not it. Of course I do want it, but it's not clouding my judgment around the actual like reality of the situation, which is why I wanted to go through all those different points. Before we get to Adam's reveal and what he thinks is going to happen with Kevin Durant here, first going to talk to you about our friends over at betonline.net. I'm going to give you a little interesting tidbit here from betonline.net. They have the over-under wins for every team in the NBA. They do not have it for two teams. You know what those two teams are, Adam?
Brooklyn and Boston.
That is correct. No over-under wins for Brooklyn or Boston. Guess who they do have the over-under for? The Phoenix Suns. That's because you know why? We already know what the Phoenix Suns team is going to be like, and so does Bet Online. There's nothing else that's going to happen with Phoenix. Bet Online knows it. We know it, and that's just one of the things you're going to get over at betonline.net. You find all of your betting needs there, odds, lines, game action, futures, obviously NFL barreling down on us as we go through the summer. Only a couple weeks away here from preseason NFL, right? You can find news and reviews of every single league. That's a little bit of a taste of what you're getting at betonline.net. Head on over to betonline.net. You learn about all the action, all the different trends happening in this world. Bet Online, where the game starts.
And where we start when we talk about my perspective on what's going to happen. Well, let's make it clear. I, too, prefer that Kevin Durant is a Brooklyn Net. Doug and I are both in the camp of what do we want to happen? Kevin Durant remains a Brooklyn Net. We'll say this 1,000 times on this episode, and people will say, what's your problem? Why do you want to get rid of Kevin Durant? Nevertheless, if the scenario is to play itself out where the trade is going to happen, or at least in my scenario, I understand where you're coming from. And by the way, the Bet Online number saying, well, if it's going to happen, it probably is going to be Boston. And I'll follow that thread and say, I think that is maybe the most likely outcome in this moment. I also think that in the end, Kevin Durant will be traded. I won't be surprised if it takes into the regular season or even up until the trade deadline, which can involve him playing and showcasing how good he still is, if anyone has forgotten that, and maybe also allowing certain teams around the league to find that they are more competitive than they anticipated, that they are closer, or that other teams in a given conference suffer injuries. And all of a sudden, that window opens up a little bit more. That maybe could work against me in that Brooklyn could feel more bullish about keeping him. But I think that whatever has happened behind the scenes, Kevin Durant wants to move on. We've talked about how he's committed to playing. He would never hold out. He would never sit out. He would also never back out of his contract or want a trade in mid-contract. Requesting the trade to me, that was it. I'm done here. And you knew that Kyrie, at a minimum, was going to be here this season. You know that Ben Simmons, if healthy, but he's going to be here this season, right? So you already knew who was on the table, and you've seen TJ Warren get brought in, whatever that means to you. You saw them make the trade for Royce O'Neal, whatever that means to you. They brought back Patty Mills. Like, you have a very concrete perspective, and you already had it almost maybe shy of TJ Warren. You had the idea of what this team was going to look like for you when you made the trade request. Could have been out of frustration, and maybe it all blows over, but he hasn't come out and said anything to the contrary, so I can't assume anything different. The reason why I think that it's likely that he gets moved is something that I started to noodle on yesterday a little bit and talked over on Twitter with some fans and just other people around the Nets. I think that there are going to be more teams that'll get back involved. And the way that I started to look at it was, whether you're talking about Boston, let's use them as that sample. Okay, Jaylen Brown is in the mix, but Boston doesn't want to give up Marcus Smart. Can't touch him. You're going to have to take a Derek White. Okay. I started to look around the league and think about, well, where are there other teams that maybe have players that could be on team options, low cost potentially, but would take draft capital in order to acquire, that the Brooklyn Nets don't want to sacrifice. So I threw out a name, and the guys that I'm talking about need not be dissected at what their level of value is. A guy like Rui Hachimura from the Washington Wizards, it makes sense that they be willing to move on from him. Could Boston go ahead and send draft capital to the Wizards to put Hachimura onto the Brooklyn Nets and give them some length, give them some size, give them another young player that doesn't strip them off of Boston? Could the Phoenix Suns if they want to get back in this discussion, look out across the landscape and say, we're going to give you some guys at the wing positions, and we're also going to go to Chicago, and we're going to take a look at a guy like Kobe White, who maybe the Chicago Bulls have effectively replaced with Caruso and other players that they have there. Also on a team option, get a buy-in there. We'll send out draft capital to a third team that affords any of these players, any of these teams, I should say, including the Toronto Raptors, to say, we'll give you a player or two from our roster, we'll give you a couple of picks, and we'll also spend some picks elsewhere to put another player on your team. I think that this is where you start to accomplish the idea of not stripping the team that Kevin Durant goes to, and Brooklyn accomplishing getting better, getting capital, and not spending anything. And sometimes people talk about maybe the Nets could go pursue somebody for a draft pick. They don't want to. I don't think Sean Marks wants to look down that road. Pause there for the obviously glowing feedback. Do you think that starts to make sense in my scenario of these teams that want to be involved, that Kevin Durant, no matter who it is on his list or otherwise, isn't going to want to go to if you talk about stripping 3, 4, 5 players away from them, get a third team involved, and start to pull in another young talent potentially that the Nets could look at as being a viable piece going forward?
Yeah, so it's really funny because I think that is viable, except that I just disagree with that the mechanics are viable. Like I think the third okay, so I'm gonna divorce the two things from each other here. I think that the third team in a vacuum is definitely viable, and also, but because it makes a lot of these situations a lot easier, right? Like it's in a lot of ways folding in a third team is harder, but it makes the ledger balance easier once you can do it, right? So like and I do agree with that. Where I think that all of this becomes hard is because we're presenting scenarios. I think the pushback we're probably going to get here, if I'm guessing, is that like this has never happened before. Both of our scenarios. Sure. Right, like yours and mine, is that this has never happened, and I get it. Nothing, something never happens until it does. Like there's not a lot of groundwork, or there's not a lot of just like examples of this kind of thing happening within the NBA world, where a superstar asks out and then it doesn't get traded. Like doesn't really happen. So I get that both of our examples don't really happen. Yours falls into that category too, because I was originally going to push back, be like, what are they going to let him play and risk injury and like go all the way to trade deadline? Except then I'm like, well, my scenario is along the same line. It's like really actually not different. Like it's not.
By the way, a superstar 1 year into his extension requesting the trade. So that's why it's like it all comes down from there. Well, if we're going to set the precedent of like something we've never seen happen, we might as well then look at the possibilities of what has never but could very well happen. It changes once it occurs. That's the sample size, right?
And let's be clear, where you're not like, because yours is actually just my thing, but more specific, right? Like your thing, your idea is the same as mine. It was just he comes back, except you just said you said another hard end date on like how long that's actually going to be the case, right? Because in your scenario, he does come back, but then is traded later, right? As more things open up. Yeah. I think that both of those are born out of the same logic, though. And the logic is, and where I don't disagree with the logic is because your logic, I think, is the same as mine, is that it's less about this specific situation with Kevin Durant and more around the rest of the landscape. The landscape is not right for this. Yeah. So the landscape is not set up for it. It's not so much that we don't think they want to do it because they're just going to stand pat and play chicken with him and want to keep him. It's that it sets up a little more that way because there's just not enough teams. There's not enough teams that are interested that have the stuff that everyone wants. Your scenario just brings in more teams, but just extends the timeline. My thing just eliminates the teams from actually being able to do it. So actually, they're not too dissimilar, but they're around the same idea. And this is what I really need everyone to hear. This is the idea. The idea is not dude, we get it. Kevin Durant asked out. We get it. All these other superstars have asked out and gotten traded. No one need explain that to me anymore. Okay. Save the keys, save the typing. Like you don't need to explain it. I totally get it. Yes. Like they let go of Kevin Durant's shooting coach and Adam Harrington. I get it. We know this. Like this is not news to any of us. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with that. It has all to do with that. The offers that are out there are just never good enough for the Nets to accept as of right now. They're not good. Like they are not good enough to accept. And if you cannot accept the trade, they're just not trading him for Mikal Bridges. Like they're not enough, please. So that's just where I land. I think we both land around the logistics around the situation more than the actual, past comps that like drawing in about why this is just going to happen.
And you know what, and we'll close out on this before we talk a little bit.
Sorry, I got to freak out. I can freak out. I can already see the comments. Like I already know what the comments are going to be.
And by the way, and as you mentioned Bridges there, that's like when we talk about these scenarios, it's again, do I think it's possible for Phoenix to send a couple of first round picks to Indiana and have Miles Turner end up on the Brooklyn Nets and then picks go out? Like, yes, but these are the viable scenarios that could play themselves out. And to your point, this is why if you tell me, oh, Phoenix, no, Bridges from Phoenix and Cam Johnson and that is not going to get it done. But if Phoenix can go and find another big piece to help move and get over to Brooklyn without Brooklyn having to sacrifice capital, it certainly opens up those possibilities. That being the case, my friends, this right here, this moment you're experiencing it in real time, is where we will stop talking about the potential outcome for the Kevin Durant situation, at least until some concrete news comes out. There's going to be a lot of other great discussions we're going to have over next week and the coming weeks here as we work our way through the summer. There it is, though. Doug looks at it and thinks that he will be back for the season and potentially beyond. I see it as he will be here for the time being, but ultimately a trade gets done. In a second here, we're going to tap back into the Seth Curry conversation around Ben Simmons and expectations and highlight some additional quotes that we didn't have at our fingertips last time we spoke. All right, my friends. So let's talk a little bit more about Kevin Durant and the trade. No, sorry. I caught myself there. Let's go ahead and talk about Seth Curry. We had highlighted last week an article that was over in Australia. He was at a Foot Locker doing an interview, and we got some additional quotes off of that interview that I think gave us exactly what you would want to hear from a teammate in Philadelphia with Ben Simmons and what we can expect from him and what his perspective is on a healthy Ben Simmons. So as we dive in on these, we're going to need what he brings to the table, said Seth Curry. Obviously, he is an all-star caliber player. Went on to say, obviously, he's trying to make the most of his offseason, get back healthy physically and mentally. Like I said, he had a year off. It's going to be good for him to get back out there on the court and to reacclimate. Some additional quotes here, but just even the first one. Obviously, he is an all-star caliber player. I think when we talked about it the last time, you said it's like this is a guy that has real experience playing with Ben Simmons. You would expect him to go, that's exactly what this guy can be once he gets himself healthy and on the court.
Yeah, this is the quote that we just didn't have the full one of before, right? Like this is the expanded quote from Seth Curry. So we're going to this is just us walking back something we said before. Happy to just get new information and speak on that information. That's what we'll always do every single time. If we'll have an opinion, if new, this is what everyone should do in your life. Try to do more of this. Okay. This is a little life tip for everyone. When you hear new information, don't feel like you need to dig your heels in further on the previous take. Good.
I was going to say, should I not go deeper and just act like I didn't see these quotes and just further? I'm just going to further cement myself, right? That there's no way I didn't hear it. And quite frankly,
well, the best part is like you'd be shocked at how many people do this. Well, anyway, the point is, this is more the expanded quote that we wanted to hear from Seth Curry. Like this is the non-alarming part. This is the part like, hey, I play with this guy. This is the, he actually says something I do disagree with. It is like less make me worry about him, but more about just like the situation. But in general, as a teammate, like he was so complimentary in an expanded take about this. As soon as I saw this take, I knew we were going to get mentions from it. It happened immediately. I get it. like it happened immediately in our mentions. Cool. I'm glad for everyone keeping us honest. But this is exactly where, and shout out to Yves Darboz. Like he was Pop Thorne. He was going to be out there ready, ripping and raring, ready to go with that one. But yeah. So anyway, like this is the kind of quote we wanted to hear from Seth. Like he's the only guy in the Nets who's played for an extended period of time with Simmons. And he sees all the stuff that he does well, which again, we knew he did all those things well. We just didn't hear it from him the first time through the quotes. That was more of what it was.
And by the way, he went on to say, just to give the additional quote here, he creates a lot of 3-point shots for his teammates. Obviously, it helps me a lot to get those good shots. The pick and roll game and the handoff game, the 2-man game. He is a good guy rolling to the rim and finishing defensively. He can guard a lot of positions. So that is what, again, describe Ben Simmons' game and how good he is. To your point, that's what you thought. That's what we thought Seth Curry would say, and then we get the quotes confirming it. In that regard, you said there's something maybe alarming about it. Before we get out the door on here,
because it's not alarming. It's not alarming, but it's just more interesting. Go ahead. Oh, it was just that. It was just that he mentioned something that he's like he doesn't need the 3-pointer. Okay. and it was a kind of a throwaway line in there where he was mentioning how he doesn't, Simmons, the long wanted thing among fans and analysts is that they wanted to see Simmons be able to stretch the court a little bit.
Right.
I think that we know at this point that's not going to happen. That's fine. Okay, it's maybe not fine, but it just is what it is. I would push back on. I think more of the problem that people have around Simmons is less about that he can't do it. Like there's lots of people that can't shoot threes. That's not new. It's that there never has seemed to be any willingness to try or to like make some like mechanical adjustments to have the shooting get a little better. I think that's where people have pushed back more on Simmons than he can't do it. Again, lots of people like Draymond Green can't shoot threes either. No one really gives him flack around it, right? Because he tries it. And go ahead.
And I think a great reason for when we're talking about Ben Simmons, it's because, well, Draymond Green never had superstar trajectory, right? When you talk about certain players and what they can be in the NBA, a guy like Ben Simmons, you say, if he develops his shot, well, then we're talking about this guy going from being all of the things that Seth Curry described him as, and also being able to knock some shots down from the perimeter. You do that, you're one of the best players in the league, and only a finite number of guys have the ability to go to that next level of their game. Talked about it with Giannis, right? He needed to expand and get better in certain areas of his game to go from being one of the best young athletic talents, freak athlete on the court, to now being one of the most dominant players in the game. You only put those type of expectations on guys that you think can get there. And if Ben Simmons never does, to your point, and to saying, does he not need it? Well, if he wants to be a superstar top tier player in the league, yes, he does. He can still be a great complementary player on a really good team and on a championship caliber team. But that's the other phase of his game that you would want to see improve in order for him to take that next, seismic leap. Isn't that just factually what you do with really good players that you think have the ceiling of being one of the best in the game?
Yeah, like when you're a max player, essentially, like there's an the expectation goes up. It's mostly about expectations. Nobody cares if no one talks about whether Day'Ron Sharpe can shoot threes, even though he's trying. It's because who cares? Like I love to see it as a Nets fan, but as a real story, is it like how big of a story is? It's not big because the expectations aren't there, right? This is all about expectations. So, and this is where there's been a disconnect at times with Simmons between the skill and the rest of it, is that the expectations, hey, you're paid like a superstar. The expectation is you should have not these massive dramatic holes in your game that don't seem like there's a lot of willingness to just be bad at while you get better at. Right? Like sometimes you just need to be bad at something in front of everybody in order to get a little better at something. And I think that's the part that people haven't seen from Simmons. So that's the pushback. But in terms of the teammate stuff with Curry, like we definitely walk that path. We're walking that stuff all the way back because having more information.
And by the way, whatever version that we talked about at the top of the show and how things can play out, Ben Simmons having that facet to his game would also dramatically shift around what could happen for this team as currently constituted, right? And going forward in the big picture. That's a part of why you look at a guy like Ben Simmons and say, boy, if you were doing more of this, we'd even look that much differently, strongly, confidently around what you can accomplish as an organization with the players you have right now.
And by the way, if he's surrounded by the right guys too the whole time in Philly, we wouldn't probably be talking about it as much. It was just a bad fit with Embiid too, stylistically. This feed with these guys would be a much better stylistic fit. There's a very good chance we would not be talking about him in the same light about what he can't do, because he's not going to be required to do those things with this current group of Nets. Now, if we ever see that it plays out, we won't know. But if this had been the timeline around who he was just always surrounded by, no one would care, because he would because everyone else would do those things and he just wouldn't. He would just lean into all the things he does really well. That just hasn't been the case. So there's been a few things that have sort of gotten in his way there. And I would say there's been times where he's probably not helped himself either. All right, we're going to get out of here. Locked On Nets. Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Leave a comment over there. Make sure you like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Is the best way and free way to help the podcast, by just liking and subscribing wherever you listen or watch.
And of course, tell me and I forget. Teach me and I remember. Involve me and I learn. Benny Franklin.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.